The town didn't look any different at night, but something about it felt more honest after dark. The streets stayed quiet longer than they should have, and the lights in the windows belonged to people who had settled into routines they never questioned. It was the kind of place where history didn't disappear, it simply waited. Elliot Vance understood that kind of stillness. He worked above Main Street in a radio station that stayed awake long after everything else had gone quiet, speaking to people he would never meet. Most nights followed the same pattern, predictable in a way that felt almost deliberate, as though the town itself preferred things to remain unchanged. Until one night, something didn't. Above the darkened storefronts, a single window remained lit, casting a faint glow onto the empty street below. Inside, the radio station carried a low, constant hum, the quiet energy of machines doing their work without interruption. The walls were lined with old posters and fading schedules, remnants of voices that had once filled the same space before gradually disappearing into memory. At the center of it all, Elliot sat with one hand resting near the console, adjusting a dial with the ease of long habit. When he spoke into the microphone, his voice was calm and steady, measured in a way that made it easy for listeners to trust him without ever really knowing him. Over time, Elliot had learned how to speak to people he couldn't see without asking too much from them. His tone remained even, his words deliberate, offering just enough connection to make people feel understood without ever becoming personal. It was not something he had planned, but something he had grown into, shaped by long nights and conversations that never quite crossed into anything complicated. Most of the calls followed a familiar rhythm. People shared small stories, asked simple questions, or filled the silence with something manageable, and Elliot guided them through it with the same controlled presence, never allowing any moment to linger long enough to become difficult. When the microphone switched off, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. Elliot leaned back in his chair, and the warmth in his expression faded into something quieter, something less defined. Across the glass, Tessa watched him with the kind of awareness that came from knowing someone well enough to notice what they chose not to say. Without the broadcast, the station felt smaller. The hum of the equipment became more noticeable, and the silence carried a weight that Elliot rarely tried to fill. It was not discomfort exactly, but a kind of distance he seemed content to maintain. Near the end of the segment, a line lit up on the console, just another caller waiting to be let in. Elliot glanced at it briefly before pressing the button, expecting the usual rhythm to continue without interruption. For a moment, there was nothing on the other end except the faint sound of someone breathing, as though they were unsure whether they wanted to be heard at all. Elliot didn't rush to fill the silence. He allowed it to settle, giving the caller space to decide. It was a small choice, almost automatic, but it changed everything that followed. When she finally spoke, her voice was controlled, careful in a way that suggested she had already decided how much of herself she was willing to reveal. She didn't introduce herself or offer any explanation. Instead, she asked a question that felt too precise to be casual. Do you think people know when they're making the decision that ruins things, or only after? Elliot straightened slightly, the shift so subtle it would have gone unnoticed by anyone who wasn't paying close attention. There was something in the way she asked it that made it feel less like a question and more like something already lived. He didn't answer immediately, which was unusual for him. His fingers rested lightly against the console as he considered his response, aware that the question carried more weight than it appeared to on the surface. It was not unfamiliar, but the way she framed it made it feel personal, as though the outcome had already been decided and she was simply looking for confirmation. When he finally spoke, his voice remained steady, but there was a quiet shift in it, something more deliberate, less distant than before. What began as a simple exchange gradually became something more layered. She responded to his answer with quiet precision, not challenging him directly, but refusing to accept anything that felt incomplete. Elliot found himself adjusting in ways he hadn't intended, speaking with less distance and more honesty than he usually allowed. From the other side of the glass, Tessa noticed the change immediately. Her attention sharpened as she watched the conversation unfold, recognizing that this was no longer routine. Something had shifted, and neither of them seemed to be controlling it anymore. What she said next came more carefully. She told him there had been someone once, someone she loved. Then one day, he left for a bigger opportunity, the kind that made sense to everyone except the person being left behind. At the time, she tried to be reasonable about it. She told herself ambition was not betrayal. She told herself she would move on. But years had passed and some part of her still hadn't. She had tried to love other people, tried to build something new, but every relationship after that had entered a life already shaped by what happened. Elliot stayed quiet. Then she said, softer, "I think the worst part is that he probably believed he was moving towards something better. He just didn't understand what he was leaving behind." That was the moment it hit him. Not just the story, the way she said it, the restraint in her voice, the old hurt buried under control. "Mara?" he said. Silence. Then, almost in disbelief, "Elliot?" The conversation didn't end abruptly or dramatically. It simply slowed, losing momentum until there was nothing left to say, and then it stopped. Elliot remained still for a moment after the line went quiet, his hand resting near the controls as though he hadn't fully returned to the room. Across the glass, Tessa raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to move forward, and eventually he did. But the rhythm was different now, slightly off in a way that was difficult to ignore. The rest of the broadcast continued as expected, but something had shifted beneath the surface. Elliot found himself paying closer attention to his own words, aware of pauses he would normally overlook. The calls came and went, familiar and manageable, but none of them carried the same weight as the one before. By the time the show ended, the silence in the station felt heavier than usual, as though it had been waiting for him to notice it. Morning brought movement, even if nothing else had changed. Elliot stood in his apartment with his phone in his hand, staring at a number he hadn't dialed in years. He wasn't entirely sure why he still had it, or why it felt as though it had been waiting for this moment. He told himself it was curiosity, something simple and harmless. Then he pressed call before he could reconsider. When she answered, there was no hesitation this time, no uncertainty, no distance, just a quiet recognition that settled between them immediately. They didn't say each other's names at first, but they didn't need to. The silence that followed was not empty. It carried the weight of everything they had left unresolved. Their conversation moved carefully, both of them aware of how much remained unspoken. They spoke about the town, about time, about the lives they had built apart, but none of it felt like the real conversation. That one remained just beneath the surface, present in every pause, waiting for one of them to acknowledge it. It didn't take long before the idea of meeting emerged, not as a sudden decision, but as something that had been forming quietly between them from the start. When it was finally spoken, it felt natural, almost inevitable. They agreed on a place they both knew well, somewhere unchanged enough to hold the past without explanation. The beach. As Mara drove toward the coast, the road felt both familiar and distant, as though memory had softened its edges over time. Each turn carried fragments of the past, moments she had not intended to revisit but could no longer ignore. She had not planned to return like this, and she had certainly not planned to see him again. Yet here she was, moving towards something she had once left behind. Elliot arrived early, standing near the edge of the overlook with his hands in his pockets as he watched the waves move in steady patterns below. The place itself had not changed, but the feeling of it had. Time had altered something less visible, something harder to define. When Mara appeared on the path, Elliot saw her before she noticed him. He remained where he was, not out of hesitation, but because the moment felt too precise to interrupt. When she finally saw him, she paused, just long enough for the distance between them to become real. They walked toward each other slowly, meeting somewhere in the middle, both aware of how much existed between them that could not be seen. Time had not erased it. If anything, it had made it more defined, more difficult to ignore. When they stood face to face, neither of them spoke right away. There were too many ways to begin, and none of them felt sufficient. The silence that followed did not feel like avoidance, but like something waiting to be approached carefully. Mara spoke first, her voice steady, without hesitation. "Did you know what you were leaving behind?" Elliot held her gaze, aware that whatever he said next would matter more than anything he had avoided before. The answer he had once imagined did not feel honest anymore. "No," he said quietly, and that was the problem. The words settled between them, carrying a weight that neither of them tried to dismiss. Mara studied his expression, searching for something that might make it easier to accept what he had said. But what she found instead was something unfinished, something that had never fully been resolved.
Their story doesn't end here, and some questions were left unanswered for a reason. If you want to see how it all unfolds and discover what happens next, you can read Static Between Us through the link in the description.